All right, friends, welcome back to the Anastasis Center for Christian Education and Ministry channel here on YouTube. And I'm Mako Nagasawa, I'm the director. And once again, I'm here with my friend, Dr. Vince Bantu, who is the author of 3 very thought-provoking books. He is assistant professor of church history at Fuller Seminary and also the founder and director of the Meachum School of Haymanot. And given, the topics today, given that this is February, Black History Month, Vince, could you remind me and tell our viewers a little bit about what you're doing with the Meachum School? What is the mission and vision?
Yeah. So thanks, Mako. And yeah, it's great to be here again and discussing this. And yeah, the Meachum School of Haymanot is a graduate school of theological education, and our mission is to provide graduate level seminary education in biblical and theological studies in a way that centers the Black experience in a global sense, like centers the Pan-African cultural approach to theology and also the concerns of the Black church and Black community, and also that upholds the traditional Christian faith and espouses and affirms Orthodox Christian doctrine and high view of Scripture, and really embodies the theology and practice of the Black church.
That sounds just really amazing. What is the URL? Just so if people want to check that out, where would we go?
Yeah. So it's at Meachum, MEACHUM.org. Yeah. So
Great.
folks to connect with us there.
Okay. And I'll also put that in the links to all these videos. So friends and viewers on the channel, we are continuing on with the theology of Marvel's Black Panther. So this is, I believe, episode 4 of a total of probably will be 5. I think this will round out Black Panther 1, and then next time we'll talk about Black Panther 2, Wakanda Forever. Where have we been on this journey, and why are we doing it? Well, I think that there is a deep resonance, not with Black Panther. We're not treating Black Panther as an allegory here. We're treating it thematically, and so the theology is thematic. We are perceiving ethics and story, and we are saying that the ethics that drive Black Panther and the story that drives Black Panther, namely that it is a story where good triumphs over evil, but in a complex way, because there's good and evil in every person. It is a pointer to Jesus. And so the structure of our times has been to look at the thematic history that Black Panther, the movie, portrays, which involves both African history and African-American history. Anyone who, is trying to honor that history would have to say Christian faith has played a huge role. Jesus has played a huge role in both contexts, and those are broad contexts. So we looked at that in session 1. We looked at the global context of 20th century nonviolent resistance movements, right? And how the civil rights movement in the US, which was spearheaded by the Black church, was actually one out of many nonviolent resistance movements in the 20th century that were Christian-led or Christian-influenced. Session 2 was about Wakanda. We looked at Wakanda as the imagination of a chosen people kind of theme, and what would it mean to be not colonized and not colonizers? So important, and we paralleled that to biblical Israel and thought through that to some degree. Third, we looked at the role of Killmonger. So we got into once we understand the vocation of Wakanda, or the potential role of Wakanda in the world, the king of Wakanda then plays a role. And there's this debate within Black Panther of, are we going to be isolationist or imperialist, or involved in a different way? And we see this debate happening between Killmonger and T'Challa, and really Nakia as well, because she is advocating for the involved model, and Killmonger actually pushes T'Challa here to be more in the involved camp and not isolationist and not imperialist. So finally, we're going to look at T'Challa, and as our as our last videos have been. I'm going to say a few things, and Vince, please chime in at any point, interrupt me, and but we're going to periodically reflect on what are we observing here, because there are these fascinating parallels between T'Challa and Jesus. I don't think it's cheesy. I think it's really well done. So let's just dive in. So here is just some high points, for those of our viewers who need a little refresh about the movie Black Panther. What I'll be glancing at is these kind of moments in T'Challa's life to struggle to be the king who does the following things, right? Like to see others with honor. I mean, that's a huge deal. To receive from his ancestors, both the positive and the negatives, or the setbacks and the mistakes that his ancestors have made. How does he do that? How does he become one with the gift from above? Vibranium in the story is the gift from above. That parallels with like God gifting himself to Israel from above. He wrestles with his inheritance. He handles suffering and descends with grace. He struggles against his counterpart and the temptation to be just violent or take retribution. He, in some ways, dies and rises again. I mean, that part that's a little poetic, but I think that's a fair way to say it. He achieves victory through human vulnerability, and then he offers the gift through his leadership. There are so many parallels to Jesus here. So let me dive in and glance at T'Challa's story. So, at Warrior Falls, when we're introduced to T'Challa and M'Baku, who challenges him, he sees others with honor. Like, even though they have, M'Baku and T'Challa have this, like this slugfest, and they beat each other up, like they're pretty in control of themselves. And T'Challa, especially at the end, calls for M'Baku to yield and say, and he says, your people need you. Like he still wants M'Baku's partnership. Like this is not a duel to the death, nor is it just like, hey, I'm just going to wail on you and take everything out I can, right? There is a way that even in the midst of this fight, T'Challa sees that M'Baku is a leader. He's charismatic. He's trusted. We need you. That is just amazing. He even does that again with Eric Killmonger. So, Killmonger comes to Wakanda and he challenges T'Challa using the Warrior Falls protocol. And I really moved very slowly through the video and caught this frame. And this frame is so well done by Ryan Coogler, because it shows that Killmonger knew he could have been defeated right here. Like, look at that expression. And he says to Killmonger, throw down your weapons. We can handle this another way. And T'Challa waited for Killmonger to get up. Like, this moment from a choreographed fight perspective, it said so much. And he sees Killmonger with honor. Like, even though he's being threatened and menaced and their fathers had beef. Wow. Then, when T'Challa goes to the ancestral plane, he receives from his ancestors. Here he is in that beautiful scene with the wide open space where I think it's the previous Black Panthers, right? Like who are kind of represented there in the trees. And he goes there for wisdom, strength, and advice. Incredible. I just wanted to point out that I've been to Uganda and I've not been to Kenya, but I've seen pictures where there's the red earth that is really unusual there for its mineral content. And it is, I was so happy to see that portrayed in Wakanda. I mean, I think Wakanda is supposed to be around that area, like the Lake Victoria area. T'Challa becomes one with a gift from above. So vibranium is the gift from above, and around it grow these heart-shaped herbs, which then the Black Panthers turn into a kind of liquid, and then they drink it, and they become one with the gift. I mean, in a very real way. It's kind of a communion motif, right? In a similar way that Jesus says, "Here's my body and blood." There's a way to become one with the gift. In Jesus' case, is becoming one with the Holy Spirit, like perfecting the oneness between humanity and divinity there. But he also wrestles with his inheritance. Like his father was not perfect, and he wrestles with that. Here, I think this is it Civil War, Avengers Civil War, where he is seeing his father for what will wind up being the last time before the bomb goes off and his father T'Chaka is killed. But you could see, like, I want to respect this man even when I am going to eventually side against him. Right? And powerful. So and that has something to do with how Jesus inherits everything from Israel that he could, both the positive and the negative, right? Like the successes and the struggles. Jesus then struggles against his counterpart, which is the temptation to go a different way. And I felt like this scene where he's looking at the two suits, it represents one kingship with two options. Of course, the other suit winds up being, the suit, the golden jaguar suit that Killmonger chooses. You have to get a little more into the story, but you wind up seeing, like, yeah, I mean, that is the choice that he makes between the involvement model and the imperialist model. I think what is really powerful, what makes T'Challa a true hero, is that he handles suffering and descends with grace. Like in the previous movie, he lost his father, but he becomes more compassionate. Yes, there is that period where he wants to kill Baron Zemo because Baron Zemo orchestrated the bomb, but eventually retracts his claws and says, "You know what? I'm not going to just take vigilante justice. I'm going to let whatever systems are here play out. It's not my role just to be backward looking. I have to be forward looking and try to trust other people, involve other people, allow systems to play out justly to the extent that that's possible." And and then there's just many examples of how T'Challa does this, right? he lost his girlfriend, but he learns from her. So here's Nakia and T'Challa as they return to Wakanda, and she steps off the ship, and she has been helping victims of human trafficking, essentially, and that's her model for how to be involved, and that's the starting point for T'Challa to think about, like, well, Wakanda could be involved in the world. We could help. We don't have to be the world's arms dealer and sell vibranium that way, but we don't have to be isolationist either. And so here he is, just like learning from her.
And just to add a comment, I think that I agree 100%. And I think we've mentioned this in some of the other episodes, but again, the way that this movie centers the leadership of Black women, I think is really important, because even the way that T'Challa and T'Chaka and Killmonger and Wakabi and M'Baku, like the way that all of these male characters, whether they're good or bad or somewhere in the middle, they're always leading from the position of being in the center. And as you pointed out, like of these different paradigms of Wakanda in the world, right? If we could even equate that to ecclesiology, like the church in the world, that Nakia's perspective emerges as the one, but she doesn't, lead from the front and center. She doesn't desire or need the spotlight. She, like you said, when we first encounter her, she's literally in the back of a truck with people who are probably meant to, evoke the idea of Boko Haram or something like that.
Right.
She's undercover, and she literally is blending in as a girl who got kidnapped. And so it's like the epitome of not needing the spotlight, and like you said, making a difference out in the world. And it just makes me think of these great women civil rights leaders and other Black women in history who have fought for justice, but don't need to necessarily be the person in the spotlight getting all the attention, but actually doing the work, and even to this day, doing the work, doing the greatest and hardest and most impactful work in the community.
That's absolutely right. I mean, even the way Nakia was kind of embedded reminds me of Jesus' incarnation, right? He steps into our world, he becomes vulnerable, and he enters into our experience. And to your point is of how, for example, in the civil rights movement, the leadership of women was so important. I mean, it could have been, my impression, it could have been even more publicly acknowledged and respected, but folks like Fannie Lou Hamer led from up front, but also there were so many women and men who held NAACP meetings in Black churches and helped organize bus boycotts. Just the simple thing of like offering rides, getting rides to people who were choosing to not take the bus to work, but so how would they get around, right? And I just think about the patience that it takes to be in a car with someone who, like, you don't even necessarily like the music they're playing on the radio, right? I mean, this is the kind of willingness to partner and sacrifice and be with people and provide real help and love for a greater cause. And that is kind of the, well, the untold story, and may it not continue that way, but it's just so important. And it is in the style of Nakia, it's in her manner of engaging. And I really felt like the screen, the Black Panther movie kind of shared the screen time, right? I mean, between T'Challa and Nakia, Queen Ramonda and Shuri and Okoye, and it was magnificent. I just felt so drawn in. Here, T'Challa continues to handle the suffering. There was this premonition, I think we had mentioned this before, of here is the elder that kind of, she is wearing the Ethiopian cross. And we talked about that a little bit with the motif of Ethiopia in actual African history and African Christian history, and how significant that is to the global body of Christ. And here is this emblem reminding us of Jesus's own death and resurrection at Warrior Falls, which it will become a place where T'Challa experiences death and resurrection. And I think one of the things we've said, we were sympathetic, but we try to be both sympathetic and critical with Killmonger and last time. And folks, viewers on the channel, if you haven't seen the video from episode 3, please do that, because it speaks to so much of a subtlety of Killmonger's characters, that he seems unable to go through suffering again voluntarily on behalf of others. And so he has so much to offer, but his unwillingness to do that, but T'Challa's willingness to do that, distinguishes them from being the tragic hero and the true hero. And so here, this characteristic is marked by the cross. So there's a powerful premonition. T'Challa loses publicly, but he doesn't dwell on that at all. The issue is not that, oh, I was humiliated or I need revenge. It's, I need to think about the future. And that's why he comes back, and that's why he engages in that. One of the big marks of that to me is that when he goes back to the ancestral plane a second time, that he confronts his father, right? And this was the powerful scene where he says, "You are all wrong," and coming from, I'm Japanese American, I come from a more community-oriented culture. Like, first of all, I can't imagine saying that, just how much courage that took to go back and say that. But also, by doing this, he's calling Wakanda forward, and he's calling them forward with him. He's saying, I want you, like, I want you to know this is what's happening, and I want you on my side. And he is expressing the true calling of Wakanda. The most powerful line from T'Challa, I think, or one of the most powerful ones, was, I cannot stay here with you, right? I guess that was an option, that he could have stayed dead, in effect, and just rejoiced in being in the presence of his heroes.
Mm.
But he says, I cannot stay here with you. I cannot rest while he sits on the throne. He is a monster of our own making. I must right this wrong. The fact that he doesn't say he's a monster of your making, like when I think he could have, I think he legitimately could have, like, there's a way that we inherit other people's problems, especially from generations past. And there's a way that we could say, this is a problem of your making, and now I have to deal with it. But he shares in that, and I caught that, and I'm getting a little choked up. This really brings tears to my eyes.
Mm. Yeah.
He rises again by his mother's hand, which, that's Queen Ramonda giving him the liquid of the heart-shaped herb there. And
also, I'm sorry to cut it, Michael. I just to add to what you were saying, I think that another just aspect, and I remember actually watching maybe a special feature or something where Ryan Coogler was talking about how even just another layer to that scene with T'Challa in the ancestral plane is even the fact that how he like raised his voice and yelled at his father and at his ancestors, and how countercultural that would be for African descended cultures and I imagine to be the similar with Japanese and other Asian descended cultures, that of like raising your voice at your elders is like just something that you don't do, and so that just lends more weight to the power of that. And also I hadn't thought of that before, but yeah, I also do think it's really powerful, the sense in which he wants to, like, again, like Christ, lay aside his glory, and the way that Jesus also if kind of interpreting T'Challa as in some ways a Christ figure, that Jesus doesn't, like he says, the pilot doesn't call down the angels that he could have to defend himself, and he lays aside the glory that he had with the Father and the Spirit to right the wrongs of humanity. And I guess there's the difference, right, is that there's no corporate sense. But even with that, I think it's also a really interesting point you made about the our own making, and I think that that's a helpful counterbalance to a lot of the individualism that we see in a lot of dominant culture US narratives around, like, often differentiating oneself from sins of the past or the present, and rather standing on one's own individual merit, rather than seeing someone as a part of a collective which is, I think, that language of our own making is not only different from the individualism we see in a lot of the modern world, but also it's also not what we see in scripture, where there's often where Israel and people are held accountable for as a corporate people.
Right. And I think that touches on, I know your heart, and in my better days mine, where we stand in the Christian tradition. And yes, there are other aspects to who we are, but we want to study both the mistakes and the successes, right? And own all of that to the degree that that's possible. But we want to say, like, this is our issue. And but it's a struggle to do that. I think and we'll come back to that a little more, I'm sure, Vince, but the continuing on with T'Challa, I think we just see descent after descent after descent, not just in terms of defeat, but his willingness to come under others, and his willingness to risk things, even his own life, right? And so in the at climactic moments, what he does is he descends. And so in his defeat, when he's defeated by Killmonger, and Killmonger throws him off Warrior Falls, that definitely is a descent. It's a descent into death, in a sense. But and then when he does enter the ancestral plane, he dies, rises again, but then he descends again, right? The final fight, as it builds up to him versus Killmonger, they fall into the mines. They fall a long way. That's a motif of descent, and it reflects his willingness to really enter into the depths of the struggle, be humbled, and things like that. by contrast, we talked about this last time. Okoye says to Killmonger, "Your heart is so full of hatred, you're not fit to be a king." There was a hatred and pride that Killmonger did not want to descend again. It's like, hey, that happened to me once. I don't want to do that again. So, but T'Challa does. And at the end, the way he achieves victory is through descent. It's through human vulnerability. He depowers the vibranium suits, right? He tells Shuri, like, turn off or I forget the mechanism, but basically, to run the train, you'd have to depower the vibranium, and the suits lose their protection. And that's how he's able to defeat Killmonger, because Killmonger would not actually do that. And this is a throwback, I think, to the beginning of the movie, where T'Challa has to get close enough to M'Baku at Warrior Falls to get hurt, but he eventually headbutts M'Baku, but he takes M'Baku's spear to his chest. Like his willingness to be close enough to be vulnerable is actually, and risk that, is what allows T'Challa to win. And finally he carries Killmonger out and says, "We can still heal you," which I think is another willingness to be vulnerable. I mean, you're gonna keep this guy alive when he challenged you to the death and wanted to usurp your throne. Like that, there's these questions, but I guess T'Challa is willing to set that aside and to say, like, we can heal you. And then finally he offers the gift through his leadership. And I know last time we talked about the United Nations and how that's a problematic institution as well. In some ways, like he tries this route and offers the gift of like some vibranium tech, right? And I guess more cooperation, education, maybe some medical tech or things like that. He starts doing that, but also he goes to Oakland and he starts an outreach center with Shuri, which I think is amazing, because he starts from the place where there was pain, where in the story, where Eric Killmonger grew up, and that connects also to the African-American story in the sense of that this is where the Black Panthers got their start as an organization. And then he tells Shuri about how their father murdered their uncle, and this doesn't solve everything, but even though he's not Black American, he honors the story by entering it at the point of being in Oakland, right? So as a person from Africa, I thought that was a powerful gesture. So
and again, to look at it through the lens of just kind of seeing T'Challa as this Christ figure, and seeing Wakanda as Israel, again going to the United Nations, and then also it kind of in a way represents the idea of the gospel going out from the Jews to the Gentiles, and
right.
T'Chaka and Wakabi and so many others could be seen as these zealots, or these people like like Peter, for example, who didn't understand that actually the gospel is for the Gentiles as well, and it's meant to go out from here. And then, like you said, going to Oakland, there's even a sense there in which we see in the New Testament how specifically communities that have been marginalized or experienced significant oppression, that there's a special emphasis placed there, that we like with the way that Paul brokers this empowerment between the Corinthian church and focusing on the Jerusalem church, and just the ways in which believers were sharing material possessions and empowering the poor and the oppressed.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh man. Or even how Luke preserves anti-empire teaching, right? In Luke 3 and Luke 19 regarding tax collectors and soldiers, of don't extort, don't exploit, and look at, even take on the cost of the injustice in your own person. You don't even have to necessarily leave your job, but absorb as much of the injustice as you can. Like, that's an incredible thing. And man, I'm blown away. Well, we'll get to some of Jesus. I'll throw up some slides, but just looking at the character of T'Challa, and again, thinking about the parallel to Jesus, which I'll get to in just a moment, I think it gives us an opportunity to reflect on the character of God, because, and here's where, there is a different, this is why we're not taking the movie as an allegory. We're taking it as in a thematic way, because number one, what if people can access divine power for evil purposes as much as for good purposes, right? I mean, I think the movie raises this question in the same way that the movie raises this question because Killmonger wants to do exactly that. He wants to access the heart-shaped herb, the power of the Black Panther, the power of Boss, but for evil purposes. And I think this raises the question, is there a two-faced God? Or are there gods who are both like good and evil? Or is it kind of like the Force in Star Wars, where there's always going to be good and evil, Jedi and Sith, and this is always going to be happening? I think the movie raises that as a question, at least for me. But coming back into the real world, right, of the real history and real Christian faith, if God is both good and, God is not two-faced. He has one face, a face of love and goodness and restoring justice, restorative justice. And so, it raises this question of to the extent that we like Black Panther because it's a happy ending story where good triumphs over evil, right? Is there a God that actually is consistent with that? Because, right, that you would have to have a God who is a good 100%. And the evil is a kind of a detour or a misdirect away from the purposes of that God. Then God steps in to restore it. But if God is both good and evil, or he just does stuff, he just raw power, and we have perceptions of good and evil that aren't rooted in anything, then that's a problem, because then evil is something we're stuck with forever. It'll just keep coming back. And there are movies like Star Wars where I'm starting to get bored because it becomes formulaic. I'm still a Star Wars fan, but
I hear you though. No,
I think that's the feeling. And so, and then this third question connected to the themes is dissent really necessary? Why can't we just ascend? I mean, because it would be a lot less painful, but there's something about goodness and love and courage engaging with evil and not becoming evil that requires dissent and a deeper dive, a humility and a willingness to be hurt and be vulnerable. That's kind of characterized by the descent of T'Challa and the descent of Jesus. Vince, do you have any other thoughts? Like, what does T'Challa's character bring up for you?
Yeah, no, I think you hit them all, and kind of what we mentioned already. But yeah, no, I'm in agreement with you.
Cool. Let's glance quickly at Jesus. I'm going to read a quote from, you'll love this, Saint Athanasius of Alexandria in Egypt, about the nature of the atonement and about God's justice, and then we'll kind of come back and reflect on this. So, of course, Jesus has the same plot elements, right, to the story. He descends and suffers. He receives from his ancestors. He wrestles with his inheritance. He sees others with honor. He becomes one with the gift from above. He struggles against the temptation. He dies and rises again. He achieves victory through human vulnerability and offers the gift through his leadership. Just amazing stuff. Quickly, just so if people want to chase some of these things down or dwell on them or reflect on them, I hope some of our viewers are using this for personal reflection or even small group discussion, like at a church context or just a neighborhood conversation. So, his descent, Jesus' descent and suffering is symbolized by Jesus becoming a baby, like the God of the universe and the Son of God, who's existed for all time, becomes this human baby dependent on his mother's milk, food, air, and water, care, human touch, all these things, just amazing. he receives from his ancestors. So these are two pictures. One is meant to help us remember the burning bush, where God was in the burning bush as a fire to refine and purify. And then Moses goes up the same mountain where that burning bush was, and then he comes back purified, like his face is lit up with divine glory. And that's just to remind us that human beings are the tragic heroes. We are made in the image of God. We're called to bear God's likeness, and given that we fell into sin, to be purified of that. So there is something in us that responds to beauty, that responds to hope, that responds to goodness and to God. So we are not pure evil. There's no villain who is pure evil in the Bible. And Jesus receives this from Israel. He also receives a corrupted human nature and responds with human faithfulness and shoulders an incredible burden for others. There's a quote in the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 5, where it says Jesus became perfect because he learned obedience. Like in relation to his human nature, it wasn't perfected instantly at conception. He had to perfect it through his own faithfulness. He sees other people with honor, right? Like he sees Simon and says, implied is, I know you're kind of an unstable, unsteady guy, but you'll be called Peter, which means a rock. Like he sees what people could become with him. And there's just a whole bunch of instances like that. And I think it's just because he sees people with honor. He becomes one with a gift from above. This beautiful painting is by an artist named Daniel Bonnell, and I asked him for permission to use his art. This is the baptism of Jesus. So the Holy Spirit is descending like a dove on Jesus when he's being baptized, but he is already in the form of a cross. And it represents the parallelism, right? Like death and resurrection is what baptism symbolized. We die going under the water, we rise coming up. Jesus already knowing that he's going to go through this, and he's already enacting that in terms of, he's purifying his humanity, and he's going to kill the thing that's been killing us, the sin sickness. He's going to rise healed and purified. Struggles against the temptation. He dies for others, obviously, and there his body enters into the earth and death and creation's plight, right? The corruption, while his soul visits the realm of souls, or Sheol, which is one of those traditional Christian teachings. It's highlighted in 1 Peter 3 and 4, and basically says, everyone who died before I died, here I am. And you get the choice to choose me. But he continues his participation in humanity's descent into death. He enters it too, and then rises by his Father's hand. He is resurrected in a God-soaked new humanity and achieves victory through human vulnerability. So in the same way, T'Challa said, I cannot rest while he sits on the throne. That does remind me of ultimately Jesus saying on the other side of resurrection, all authority is given to me, right? Like someone else has been on the throne. I need to get to that throne, not just for my own sake or for my own feelings of I want to feel superior, but it's for everyone else. Like I have become human in order to bring humanity back to the place of authority that human beings were meant to have and share in God's kingdom. And offers the gift through his leadership, gives the Holy Spirit to us so that Jesus could do in us what he did in his own human nature, make us united with God by the Spirit, help our humanity to be purified. And he does it for all. So in the same way that Killmonger said, ain't all people your people, Jesus says, yes, all people are my people. And that's why he's called a new Adam. So he really does claim everybody. And in the same way that T'Challa said, we can still heal you, right? Jesus to those who have opposed him. I mean, at some level, we've opposed him at some points in our lives, but he says, I came that you might have life. Like this is why I'm here, to heal you. And he starts in places where there have been Oaklands, right? Like they're places of struggle and pain and injustice and hope in our world. I gave a message a few weeks ago at my church on how Jesus began his ministry in Galilee. Why Galilee? Well, yeah, it's true. It's because Isaiah predicted and prophesied that and hoped for it, but it's because Galilee was conquered first by sin, right? I mean, that's where the Assyrian kingdom swept in and took over the north. Why? Because that's where sin conquered first. So Jesus goes to places where, people have been broken, where injustice has been done, where sin has been done, or at least its consequences are felt. So, and calls for us to follow his leadership. When M'Baku basically says, yeah, I'll help you. I'll help T'Challa come back to the throne. That reminded me of John the Baptist, right? Saying he must increase, but I must decrease. That was just I loved his character. And I look forward next week to talking more about him because he plays just a cool role in Wakanda Forever. And eventually, again, I think this is why social commentary inevitably has to engage Jesus, because in, the fictional story of Wakanda, where they are not conquered, but they're also not conquerors. We also see Christian reconciliation movements trying to address injustice, call out evil, engage with, calling people to repent, calling for repair and restitution. And I think it's because in the Christian story, Jesus is God's way of healing the problem of human evil with human partnership. This is the quotation that I wanted to share, and Vince, I know you'll have some cool thoughts about it. This is from Athanasius, Bishop of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th century. Some things that also have a bearing on our appreciation of Black history, African history, and African-American history. He blessed and commissioned Frumentius, who was the Abba Salama, the first Abuna, or father of the Ethiopian church. That was 328, I believe. He defended the divinity of the Son and the Nicene Creed and gave us the formal way of talking about the Trinity. And then he was actually the first to identify the New Testament as the 27 books that we receive. I know that there's a portion of the Syriac-speaking church that has 22 books, and the Ethiopian church has some variation. But I mean, for the majority of Christians, this is the guy. So what does he say about Jesus? He says this: had it been a case of a trespass only and not of a subsequent corruption, repentance would have been well enough. And that's amazing by itself, right? You know that I like to criticize penal substitutionary atonement as portraying God's justice as if it's purely retributive and not restorative. God's more concerned about satisfying his own anger than about actually fixing the problem, right? Which would make him a colluder with human evil. Like, if that's really what's happening. And Athanasius' statement here of like, look, Adam and Eve could have made a mistake, but they could have said sorry. And that would have been fine. But the issue was they corrupted their humanity. But once transgression had begun, men came under the power of the corruption proper to their nature, and were bereft of the grace which belonged to them as creatures in the image of God. No, repentance could not meet the case. Thus, taking a body like our own, because all our bodies were liable to the corruption of death, he, the Son of God, Jesus of Nazareth, surrendered his body to death instead of all, or in the place of all, and offered it to the Father, that he might turn again to incorruption men who had turned to corruption, and make them alive through death by the appropriation of his body and by the grace of his resurrection. In other words, he makes his own death the doorway through which we can be healed, right? Like, so that we can die and rise with him and share in his healed humanity, because he had shared in our broken humanity. Thus, he would make death to disappear from them as utterly as straw from fire. So I love this, because this is the early Christian understanding. This They are saying that God's justice is restorative, that the atonement is restorative, it's healing. And man, this is how we are to understand like God's goodness at work in the world. And so, you know, the questions that I love to pose to people, and again, folks, if you're listening to this and you're using this for personal reflection or a springboard for more study or group discussion, please think about these two questions. I want to name these, and then Vince, let's chat about them. Number one, if God did not offer the healing of human nature to us in Jesus, then wouldn't God be complicit with human evil? Right? Like if he's not actually trying to solve the problem down to its source, then wouldn't he be evil? Number two, is our appreciation of happy ending stories God calling us to join Jesus and participate with Jesus? So here's what I mean. Like I watch Black Panther. I love happy ending stories. And I don't need all my movies to be happy ending stories. I mean, I understand the value of sad stories, documentaries where there's something still to be resolved and things like that. But non-happy ending stories often can make me feel defeated. Like, oh, there's just never going to be a resolution. Happy ending stories at least give me some hope, or they, in the sense of they direct me to Jesus, because the Bible really is the world's first happy ending story, right? Like there's a God who's good enough to heal the problem of human evil down to its source in a loving way without becoming evil himself. And our love for movies like Black Panther and other happy ending stories is a sign that we're made in the image of God, that we want a happy ending, like really, and in real history, real time. And we can experience markers of that, signposts of that. So those are some things that I think about. Vince, what comes up for you? I mean, I know also you're teaching class on witness and justice. So, you know, to me, that what Athanasius is saying is we can call people to Jesus and to live a life of justice, care for others, because the central problem is the problem of human evil. And if Jesus saves us from human evil, then yeah, we could do that. So we could be about witness and justice. So good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think I'm so glad you brought up too the connection between, you know, Athanasius and how Christianity was continuing to spread into Africa, and you know, we have the picture there of the leader of I think it was the merchant tribe who had the Ethiopian cross. And so I love the connections that we're making here, you know, with that's how Christianity, if we're relating vibranium, right, to the gospel, to God's presence comes down from heaven, and it's, you know, and we're seeing these emblems of Ethiopia. Then now we're quoting the most prominent Egyptian theologian, and Egypt is really the beginning of Christianity in the continent of Africa. And you know, Black Panther is all about Africa and African identity, and Jesus and the Mary and Joseph, they sojourn as refugees in Egypt. And so literally the Lord stood and lived on the continent of Africa during the first years of his life, and from Egypt the church continued to grow and the gospel continued to spread. The vibranium of the gospel continued to spread, and it went into Ethiopia through Athanasius. And as you said, Athanasius and among others were some of the biggest defenders of the gospel and of Orthodox theology. You know, as you said, like in a more holistic vision of the atonement, right? Not just retributive, but restorative.
Right.
He defended the divinity of the Spirit as well, because there were people who were arguing. In fact, I was literally just, before we got on this call, I was literally just working on a translation I'm working on from a theologian that came much later, who actually draws on Athanasius' work from Ethiopia, actually the first attested Ethiopian theologian, who, you know, from the 15th century, who quotes Athanasius in his defense against the people who denied the divinity of the Spirit. And but in the same way, as you said, Athanasius defended the divinity of the Son and the full Trinity, the three-part Godhead, Father, Son, and Spirit, and the way that faith went, the gift of that, right, the vibranium of the gospel went from Egypt
Right.
into Ethiopia, and and even at a time actually when the I think it's an interesting point historically, and we can also say that in some ways Athanasius was a T'Challa figure or a Christ figure who was persecuted. He was exiled 3 different times by the Roman emperor, and oftentimes we again we think of we were talking about happy endings, and we think of like the Council of Nicaea as this
Right.
happy ending when heresy was put to bed, and all of the Christian world was united in the belief in the Trinity and in the divinity of Jesus. But actually Athanasius, after the Council of Nicaea, that the Roman Emperor Constantine and then his son Constantius were persecuting and exiling Athanasius, and were siding with the Arians, the people that
Right.
said that Jesus was less than God. And again, to Athanasius's point in this treatise here, Jesus can't do what he did, become, like you said, the doorway to restoration and salvation, if he's also not God. He couldn't have died if
Right.
he wasn't fully a human, but he also would not have been able to take on the punishment, the curse, the disease of sin, and then heal the world, and even go down into Sheol and to free the
Right.
captives, if he was not also fully God, if he was not fully divine. And
Right.
so, yeah, and then so Athanasius lives out the rest of his career as the patriarch, being on the run and being
Right.
being persecuted. But and that's another part of the backdrop of Christianity going into Ethiopia, because when Christianity came in Ethiopia, it was in the middle of this huge controversy, and the Roman Emperor Constantius did not like the fact that the Ethiopians were embracing Orthodox Christianity through Athanasius and his, like you said, his sending of Frumentius into Ethiopia as the first Abuna. And so the Constantius actually sent a letter to the king of Ethiopia, threatening him, essentially saying, have nothing to do with Athanasius, and also have nothing to do with this belief in Jesus being fully God. And
Wow.
the Roman emperor was trying to impose Arianism into Ethiopia. And so at a time when the king of Rome, of the Roman Empire, essentially the king of what we now call Europe, was a heretic and was
Yeah.
attempting to espouse heretical doctrine all over the Christian world, at that same time Africans were actually espousing the Orthodox doctrine that Jesus is God. And you had an African nation, the first sub-Saharan African nation, Ethiopia, embrace Christianity independently of the Roman Empire, embrace Christianity and create theology and doctrine that, like we see in that woman's cross from the movie. But also in Egypt, under imperial colonial rule from Rome, African leaders like Athanasius were still allowing themselves, like T'Challa, to suffer for what was right, rather than just go along with the doctrine that was being promoted by the empire. And so anyway, just yeah, so many
That is
parallels
amazing.
here. Yeah.
That is amazing, Vince. Thank you. Oh, thank you for pointing that. I had no idea Constantius wrote a letter to Ethiopia.
Mm-hmm.
That
Yeah.
is underhanded.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah, but and so yeah, Athanasius actually quotes the letter from Constantius to King Ezana, and Ezana was the first king of Ethiopia to become a Christian, who Frumentius evangelized, and they actually grew up together. Frumentius was a slave, and that's the other irony, is that we often think of Christianity coming into the lives of Africans through slavery, in the sense of so it's ironically in a way true, only in a very reverse way, because we think of the Africans being the slaves and the Europeans being the so-called Christians who are imposing Christianity. And the interesting thing is, 1,000 years before European slave ships came to the west part of Africa, Christianity came into the east part of Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa and Ethiopia, and it ironically was through slavery, only it was actually the non-African who was the slave, and it was actually the Africans who were the slave owners. And King Ezana's father owned Frumentius, who was from Syria and grew up in Ethiopia as a slave, and grew up, was a servant essentially of Ezana, and they grew up together, and he shared the gospel with Ezana, who he led to Christ. This slave, this Syrian slave, led this African king to Christ, and then Ezana freed him. And again, instead of just going back, is Frumentius's brother Odysseus, he just ran back home to Syria and didn't look back. But Frumentius, instead of, after he had grown up a slave in Ethiopia and he had the ability now to be free by the king, instead of going back home to Syria, he went to Athanasius and said, I want to go back to Ethiopia and I want to help to build the church, because now the king is a Christian and there's many Christians that have come to faith, and I want to help to grow the church. And that's how he became the first Abuna. And Athanasius, the person we're talking about, sent him back to Ethiopia and ordained him as that first bishop. So we see more of these parallels of people who are these leaders who are not looking out for their own interests, but the interests of the whole community, and how that happened in Africa with the gospel. But yeah, that whole letter is preserved in Athanasius's treatise that he wrote against Constantius. So it's his apology, or his apologia to Constantius.
That is bonkers.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, thematically, I mean, doesn't that make us pause and think about descent, right? Like the Frumentius's willingness to suffer again, Athanasius's willingness to suffer again, potentially Ethiopia's willingness to suffer the anger of the Roman Empire, because at the time there was more support for Arianism in the emperor's seat than the Nicene faith. So, wow. Thematically, that is beautiful. Vince, I would love to, if you ever teach a class on Athanasius, maybe we could do it together, because there's some beautiful things about this time period, and challenging things as well, but there's so much to learn from. So, for our viewers again, I am thinking about comments that Vince and I made back in episodes 1 and 2 that relate to these things. The history of Christian faith in different places, especially non-Western, non-European contexts. That is so important to understand and acknowledge, because as we seek to restore the very best of Christian faith and practice, this is we want to stay reflecting on these things and in a posture of learning. And I'm so grateful for the movie Black Panther and Ryan Coogler's work here. And just to touch a little bit, just to say something that we said before in session 1, it's not like we have a personal relationship or friendship with Ryan Coogler. So this isn't us saying we know what was in his mind. It's more us saying, look, Black Panther is a story that intersects with real history, real African history and real African-American history. And when we do that, we have to account for the presence of Christian faith and the influence of Jesus. And so, although it's true that Ryan Coogler did go to a Catholic high school, I believe, I think in Oakland, and I'm sure that serves him well in his own understanding. We are not saying that he intended all this. It's just, I think Vince and I are saying this was unavoidable. It was unavoidable. If you make a story that intersects with these areas of history, it is unavoidable that we would have to talk about Jesus. So with that, Vince, do you have anything, closing comments or things that you might encourage our viewers with?
Yeah, no, I think you said it, brother. Yeah, so no, this is man, this is a lot of fun and great to intersect so many things that, honestly, probably my 3 greatest loves, which is, the Lord and Blackness and movies. So this is awesome.
Well, Vince, thank you so much. I know you wear many hats and have a lot of people in your life and demands on your time. So I appreciate you doing this. We'll do one more on Wakanda Forever. Everyone here on YouTube, please look forward to that. And Hope you stay with us till then.